By the time I pulled off the turnpike and followed the cracked access road down toward Black Ridge Travel Plaza, it was a little after 10 p.m. The rain had stopped maybe 20 minutes earlier, but the whole lot still looked wet enough to hold light. Every pole lamp threw a long yellow smear across the pavement. Diesel sheens sat in the truck lanes in flat ribbons, and farther out, the parked rigs looked half real, half cut out of the dark behind them. The place sat by itself outside Beckley, West Virginia, like it had been dropped there for the highway and nothing else. A low convenience storefront, fuel islands, diesel lanes running off to one side, a truck lot stretching farther back than I liked, row after row fading into black. On the hill beyond it, the trees were just one solid wall. Appalachian night does that. It doesn't feel empty. It feels occupied by things you can't sort into shapes. My pickup sounded worse than usual when I eased it into a space near the front. The engine clicked after I shut it off. For a second, I just stayed there with both hands on the wheel, looking at the windows of the store and the white glare spilling out onto the wet concrete. I wasn't nervous in any clean, useful way. I was tired, already behind on money, and sick of having to act like I had a plan when I didn't. I looked down at my left wrist before I got out. I'd been doing that all week. The skin there was paler where the watch had sat for years. It looked wrong without it, too bare, like part of me had been peeled off and carried somewhere else. Thomas Halstead had worn that watch longer than I'd been alive. When he got bad at the end, bad enough that talking cost him more than he wanted to spend, he still pulled it off and worked it into my hand. I'd worn it ever since. Then I'd handed it across a glass counter to Martin Keene because Alan Brees wanted his money fast and I didn't have enough of it. Nobody got hurt in the wreck. That was the part I kept coming back to, like it helped. I'd glanced at my phone too long trying to make sure I was still on the right road, clipped the rear corner of Brees's parked car, cracked the taillight, wrinkled the metal around it, and turned one stupid second into a bill I couldn't cover. Brees didn't want to drag it through insurance. I didn't want a cop standing there asking questions I didn't have good answers for. So I paid what I could and made up the rest by walking into Keene's pawn shop with my father's watch in my pocket and my stomach trying to climb out through my throat. Keene said he could hold it a few days. That was as much mercy as I was getting. Black Ridge was hiring overnight, start fast, night differential, no interview worth the name. That was enough. I grabbed the door handle and stepped out. The air had that after-rain cold that settles low and sticks to your jeans. Somewhere out by the diesel pumps, an engine idled with that deep, steady vibration you feel more than here. Another truck rolled slowly through the lot, headlights sliding over the parked rows in the side of the building before turning away. I shut my door and headed in under the glow of the storefront. The automatic doors opened before I was all the way there. Warm air hit me first, then the smell of burnt coffee, hot roller food, floor cleaner, and old fryer grease that had worked its way into everything. Inside was brighter than it had any right to be. The fluorescent lights made the tile look too clean in some places and not clean enough in others. Every shiny surface caught the light hard. After the dark outside, it felt almost medical. I saw most of the place in one sweep before the doors shut behind me. Front counter straight ahead with 2 registers. Coffee station off to the side under menu boards and plastic creamer bins. A lottery rack near the cigarettes. A hallway sign pointing toward showers and restrooms. A small radio base on the back counter. Windows all along the front, looking out at the lot like the store had been built to keep watching it. A woman behind the counter looked up from a clipboard. Mid-50s maybe. Tired face, no wasted movement. She had that specific look people get in places that never close, where the hour stops mattering before the week does. "You're William?" Elaine asked. "That's me," I said. She looked at the clock. "You're on nights." There wasn't much to say to that. She set the clipboard down, came around the edge of the counter, and pointed things out without much interest in whether I was impressed by any of it. "Coffee's there. Showers are down the hall. "Don't disappear on us," she said. Then she was already moving again, checking something near the register, glancing at a monitor, living in the place like she'd had to do it too long to waste energy explaining it. I nodded and took a couple steps farther in. The heater kicked somewhere above me with a dry rattle. One of the cooler fans hummed at the back. The coffee burners gave off that faint electrical warmth I always associate with places where people are awake for reasons they'd rather not explain. Outside the windows, the truck lot looked flatter and more distant from in here, like the glass was pushing it away. I told myself it was fine. It was a truck stop, a travel center off the highway. Wet pavement, bad coffee, fluorescent lights, night staff with short tempers. None of that meant anything. I only needed the paycheck. I only needed enough hours to get back in front of Martin Keene before he changed his mind and sold the watch to somebody who'd appreciate it in a way that would make me hate them. I was still standing there taking in the front of the store when the automatic door gave a quick shudder to my left. Not a full open, more like it started, caught itself, and stopped. I turned toward it on reflex. Nobody was outside the glass. Nobody was coming up the sidewalk. The wet concrete under the lights was empty, clear to the edge of the nearest fuel island. A second later, the chime sounded over the door. It came late. Just a soft digital ding after the movement was already over, like the sound had gotten there after the fact. I stood there a second longer than I meant to, looking through the windows at the lot beyond them. Rows of trucks, sodium glow, wet ground, dark hill behind everything. It was a big place to look that still. Then I looked back toward the counter and told myself I just needed the job, not the place. At the time, I still thought those were the same thing. Elaine Burrow trained the way tired people do when they've stopped pretending every new hire might be worth the effort. She stood behind the counter with a clipboard tucked under one arm and moved through the register screen without looking at me much. Gas prepay, diesel receipts, cigarettes, lottery, cash drops, drawer counts. The place used an old point-of-sale system that hesitated on some buttons and froze if you rushed the card prompt. There was gray tape on one corner of the reader where somebody had cracked the casing and decided that was good enough. From the counter, I could see most of the store in one sweep. Coffee station on the left, roller grill case with hot dogs turning under a cloudy shield. Coolers along the back wall, lottery rack and cigarette shelves behind me. Off to the right, a narrower stretch of floor led to the shower hall and restrooms. A half door behind the register opened into the back office, storage, and the employee cooler farther in. The whole layout felt built around what you could keep in sight without moving your feet. Lacey Harlan came out of the hall carrying a stack of towels and set them down beside the register. She was younger than Elaine, all quick hands and flat effect, moving like somebody who had done this enough times to get bored without ever relaxing. She uncapped a dry erase marker and tapped the shower board mounted beside the monitor bank. Lacey looked at the board. Showers go fast after midnight. There were 4 shower rooms, each tracked by room number, towel count, and the last time somebody marked it occupied or cleaned. She wrote one short note, capped the marker again, and glanced at me like she was deciding whether I looked like the kind of man who made work harder for other people. She pointed with her pen. "You mark the room, towel count, and time. Don't wing it." I watched how she did it. Check the board, check the hall camera, write it down, no guessing, no shortcuts. It was simple enough, but it had that feel some jobs get where the order matters more than the task itself. Elaine was already on to the next thing. "Stay where I put you, do the checklist, and don't make me chase you," Elaine said. That covered most of the job, apparently. For the next stretch of the shift, I learned the place by doing small things badly the first time and less badly the second. A man in reflective work gear bought black coffee and a breakfast sandwich that had probably been rolling since before I got there. A trucker with red eyes and a Tennessee ball cap asked for Marlboro Reds and counted out bills that smelled faintly like diesel fuel and cold air. A woman with two half-asleep kids in the back of her SUV bought energy drinks, wipes, and a phone charger she clearly didn't want to be paying for. The front doors kept opening. The chime kept sounding. Every time I heard it, I noticed it more than I should have. That was probably because of the strip of pale skin on my wrist. I kept looking down at it when nobody was at the counter, like the watch might have somehow worked its way back there while I wasn't paying attention. It never did. Thomas Halstead had worn that watch for years. It wasn't flashy and it wasn't worth a fortune, but it was solid and old, and the kind of thing a certain kind of man would appreciate the second he picked it up. Martin Keene had appreciated it plenty. He'd turned it over once in his hand, listened to it, and looked at me over the counter with that expression pawnbrokers get when they already know how much your bad week is going to cost you. "I can hold it a few days," Martin told me. I'd nodded because I didn't trust myself to say much. After that, I can't promise you anything. That was how I ended up there. Alan Brees had wanted money after I clipped the rear corner of his parked car. I didn't have enough. I paid what I could, and my father's watch covered the rest. They were hiring overnight and starting people fast. That was all the logic I needed. The first time I got a proper look at Vern Haskell, he came in from the side of the building instead of the shower hall. Older man, gray in the beard, work jacket, steady posture. Nothing flashy about him. But the second he stepped behind the counter, the place seemed to recognize him. Elaine didn't explain who he was. Lacey didn't look surprised to see him. He checked one of the lot monitors, then the radio, then the coffee station, all with the same quiet attention. Vern looked at me. "First night?" "It is," I said. He took a second before answering. "You'll remember this one." There was no smile after, no wink, no tone that turned it into a joke. That was what caught me. Elaine was practical. Lacey was efficient. Vern looked like a man who had been paying attention to the wrong things in that building for too long and had stopped trying to explain why. I kept working because I wasn't there to understand Black Ridge. I was there to ring up cigarettes, learn the shower board, keep one eye on the truck lot, and make enough money fast enough to get Thomas Halstead's watch out of Martin Keene's shop before somebody else decided it was worth taking home. The first thing that made Vern Haskell pull me aside wasn't dramatic enough to feel important at the time. That was probably why it stuck. It happened maybe 40 minutes after he'd given me that line about remembering my first night. I was behind the register ringing up a driver buying aspirin, beef jerky, and a black coffee so scorched it smelled like the bottom of a pot left on too long. He slid his card, signed the screen, took the receipt, and headed for the door. I watched him go because that was part of the job. Keep your eyes moving. Counter, customers, windows, lot, back again. The doors opened for him. The chime didn't sound. It came a beat later, after he was already outside. I looked at the entrance a second too long. The driver kept walking under the lights toward the pumps like nothing had happened. But Vern, who had been down at the coffee station sorting creamer sleeves into a plastic bin, looked up the exact moment the chime came late. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired in a way that told me this wasn't new. He crossed behind the counter without hurry and stopped near me while the next customer was still digging through his wallet. He didn't interrupt. He just waited until the man left with his cigarettes, then jerked his head once toward the coffee station. I followed because that seemed easier than making him ask twice. The store kept doing what stores do at night. A reefer unit hummed out in the lot. Someone laughed too loud near the restrooms, and then stopped. The roller grill kept turning under its heat lamps. But standing next to Vern at the coffee station, with the warm, burnt smell of it in the air and the front windows reflecting half the room back at us, I got the feeling I'd stepped a little sideways out of the normal shift and into something narrower. Vern kept his eyes on the door. If those front doors open and you don't hear the chime, don't greet anybody. That was the moment the whole thing could still have gone one of two ways in my head. One version was simple. Older night shift guy messing with the new hire. Every workplace has one. A story here, a superstition there, enough to see if you'll spook easy. I'd worked around enough men like that to know the type. The other version was harder to name. It wasn't that what he said sounded scary. It sounded specific. Specific in a way people usually only get when they've repeated the same warning enough times to stop dressing it up. He moved before I said anything, going from the coffee station to the carafes like he was checking levels. I stayed beside him because I hadn't been told not to. He tapped the coffee station. At 2:13, you fill it once. If it's already full, you leave it alone. I almost smiled at that one. Not because it was funny, exactly. Because it was so weirdly exact it crossed over into irritation. If he'd said sometime after 2, maybe. If he'd said, watch the coffee overnight, sure. But 2:13 a.m. felt like the kind of detail a person picks when they want the story to sound stranger than it is. Then again, Vern still didn't sound amused. That mattered more than the rule itself. He took me toward the register again, then stopped with one hand on the edge of the counter and pointed with 2 fingers toward the hallway sign for showers and restrooms. He pointed toward the shower hall. If somebody asks for shower 4 after midnight, you check the board first. I looked over at the board automatically. 4 rooms, dry erase marks, towel counts, times, the ordinary little system of a place that had to move tired strangers through basic needs without letting things pile up. Shower 4 didn't look any different from the others. That made his wording worse somehow. He hadn't said watch the showers. He hadn't said watch the hall. He'd named one room. That was the first point where I started thinking, maybe this was hazing after all, because there's a kind of workplace prank built exactly out of details like that. Pick a harmless object. Give it a story. Wait for the new guy to build the rest of the fear himself. But Vern wasn't performing for an audience. Elaine Burrow was at the other register doing paperwork and not listening. Lacey Harlan was restocking creamer cups and not glancing over. He wasn't trying to land a joke. He was putting something in my head because he wanted it there. We kept moving. That was another thing that made it feel less like a speech and more like a handoff. He never stood still and announced anything. He just placed each rule where it belonged, like the building itself was the only map he trusted. At the front windows, he stopped again. Outside, the diesel lanes ran under hard white light, and beyond them, the truck lot dropped away into dimmer rows and black space between the rigs. A few marker lights glowed out there. Farther back than that, nothing. He looked through the glass toward the lot. Between 3 and 3:30, you don't go past the diesel lanes. That one I understood on a basic level, even before I understood anything else. Night lots always look shorter from inside than they are in real life. Distances flatten through glass. A man can look 20 yards away and turn out to be twice that once you step out into wind and dark. If Vern had told me that because of drifters, trouble, theft, or any other normal thing that lives in truck stops after midnight, I would have taken it without thinking much about it. But he hadn't said be careful out there. He'd said, don't go past. That landed differently. The last one came when we were back near the radio base behind the counter. It sat charging beside the monitor bank, quiet at the moment except for a soft bed of static that never completely went away. Vern rested a hand near the radio. If this thing calls your name twice in the same voice, you answer once. That's it. That was the first rule that made the skin along the back of my neck tighten for real. It still sounded stupid in one way. A radio's a radio. Somebody talks through it or they don't. But it was also the rule that sounded least like a prank, because no normal prank depends on you noticing whether a voice is the same twice. No normal prank asks you to trust your ear more than your eyes. And he still hadn't smiled. I looked at him then. Really looked. Vern had the kind of face some men get after years of bad sleep and too much fluorescent light. Not weak, not soft, just worn in a way that made every serious thing sound plainer and heavier, because he didn't have energy left to decorate it. He looked toward the hall, not at me, when he gave me the only explanation I got. John didn't listen, Vern said. That name hung there for a second. John Pritchard. I didn't know who he was yet, and Vern offered nothing else. He didn't say quit, disappeared, got hurt, got fired. Just didn't listen. That was worse in its own way because it left too much room around it. A few minutes later, while Lacey updated the shower board, I noticed an older schedule sheet tucked partly under the clipboard by the register. Most of the names meant nothing to me. One of them did because Vern had put me in the mood to notice names that didn't belong. Eddie Mays. I only saw it for a second before Elaine flipped the sheet over and wrote on something else. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody explained who Eddie Mays had been or if he still was anything at all. But by then, I had already learned something more useful than any explanation would have been. Black Ridge had rules Vern Haskell didn't tell like stories. He told them like procedures. I still didn't believe in them the way he did. Not really. I thought parts of them sounded dumb, parts of them sounded too specific, and all of them sounded like the kind of thing a man picks up after too many overnight shifts in a place with bad lighting and too much empty glass. But I also knew I wasn't laughing anymore. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the words themselves. The fact that Vern Haskell had given them to me like he expected I might need them before sunrise. By the time the clock over the cigarette wall crept past midnight, I had been at Black Ridge long enough for the place to start feeling familiar in the wrong way. Not comfortable, just mapped. I knew where the cheap chargers hung, which coffee lids stuck together, which register button liked to lag, and how long it took the front doors to open all the way when somebody came in carrying too much in both hands. The first layer of strangeness had settled under the routine, which made it easier to ignore and harder to shake. That was how most bad things start at work, not with panic, with repetition. I was at the front counter when the first real one happened. A man in a mud-streaked jacket came up with a bottled tea, a honey bun, and a phone cable that looked like it had been picked up in irritation more than need. He had the heavy-eyed look a lot of the late-night customers had, like he'd already used up the part of himself that handled decisions and was moving through habit now. I rang him up, bagged the cable because it was easier than asking, and slid the receipt toward him. "You need a receipt?" I asked. "I'm good," he said. He took the bag and headed for the entrance. I watched him go because watching people leave was half the job in a place like that. Make sure they were actually leaving. Make sure they weren't circling toward the restrooms with unpaid food stuffed into a sleeve. Make sure they weren't the kind who liked to linger just long enough to become your problem. The doors opened for him. This time, the chime sounded on time. He stepped out under the light, shoulders hunched against the damp cold, and kept going toward the pumps. I dropped my eyes back to the screen, cleared the transaction, checked the line of the lot through the glass, then reached for the next pack of cigarettes somebody wanted from behind the counter. That was when the doors slid open again. No chime. I didn't think. I reacted. "Even," I said. The word died halfway out of my mouth because Vern's rule came back to me a split second too late. Not after the reflex, not before it, right in the middle, where it did the least good. I froze with one hand still on the cigarette shelf and my eyes on the register screen. I didn't look up. That much at least I managed, but I listened for the next thing that should have happened. Footsteps. Every normal person who came through those doors gave you something. Boot heels, wet soles on tile, a cartwheel, the scuff of a bag clipping the sensor pedestal, some sound that proved a body had crossed from the cold outside into the heated store. I heard nothing. Not soft, not distant, nothing. The air in front of the registers stayed the same. No draft, no movement at the corner of my vision, just the hum of the cooler fans, the slow turn of the grill rollers, and somewhere far back, a toilet flushing down the hall. A few seconds passed like that. Then the doors closed. Still no chime. My throat felt dry all at once. I kept my eyes down another second because now I didn't know whether looking up would make me feel stupid or worse. Finally, I did it anyway. Nobody stood in front of the counter. Nobody was moving toward the coffee station. The entry mat by the doors was empty. Through the glass, the damp pavement outside shone under the lights, bare all the way to the nearest pump island. I checked the lot again in case somebody had come in, changed their mind, and turned right back out. There was no one close enough to make that make sense. The mud jacket customer was already by his truck, opening the door. The late chime from earlier came back to me then, and I hated how fast my mind started trying to build a pattern out of things that could still have been mechanical. Automatic doors screw up, sensors lag, chimes delay. I knew that. Everybody who'd worked around old hardware knew that. I told myself exactly that while my heartbeat was still coming down wrong. The trouble was the part I couldn't file under bad equipment. There had been no footsteps. Lacey came up beside me a minute later with a roll of quarters and a sleeve of cup lids tucked under one arm. I must have looked strange enough to register. Lacey looked at me. "You look pale." "I'm fine," I said. She kept looking for half a beat like she didn't believe me, then set the quarters down in the drawer tray and went back toward the coffee station. I exhaled through my nose and tried to do the same thing with the whole incident. Put it somewhere practical. Faulty doors, long shift, too much bright light after the dark outside, nothing to build a religion around. For a while that worked. The store stayed busy enough to keep me from dwelling on it. A pair of guys in work boots came in for hot sandwiches and fountain drinks. A woman in scrubs bought ibuprofen and a bottled mocha. A trucker wanted a shower and got room 2. I watched the board the way Lacey had shown me. Mark the room. Mark the towel count. Mark the time. Keep moving. But once a thing gets under your skin, routine doesn't scrape it out. It just gives it room to settle. A little before 2:13 a.m., I noticed myself checking the clock over the cigarette wall, then the register time, then the microwave over by the hot food case. I hated that I was doing it, hated more that I had already remembered Vern's second rule before the minute hit. At 2:13 a.m., you fill it once. If it's already full, you leave it alone. The number changed. I grabbed an empty pot and went to the coffee station. All 3 pots were already full. I stopped so hard, the glass pot in my hand gave a tiny clink against the warmer edge. Fresh coffee sat dark and shimmering under the fluorescent light. Not old enough to have formed that skin it gets after too long. Not low enough to suggest somebody had topped them off as part of normal flow. Just full. All 3. I stood there with the empty pot in my hand and thought first of Lacey. Maybe she'd done it. Maybe Elaine had. Maybe Vern had, though I hadn't seen him touch the station in the last several minutes. Maybe I'd missed something while I was ringing people up. That should have been enough. It should have been simple. Leave it alone. Go back to the counter. Instead, I let irritation get there first. I was tired, embarrassed to be taking any of this seriously, and sick of feeling like the new guy in some joke everybody else understood. My eyes shifted toward the dark window behind the condiments before I could stop them. At first, all I saw was the inside of the store reflected back at me. Sugar packets, creamer cups, my own shoulder and arm, the bright strip of counter behind me. Then, something in the reflection came wrong by just enough. It looked like there was someone standing at the front register, not in the room behind me, in the glass. I turned immediately. The register area was empty. No customer, no shape, no one waiting by the lottery rack. The line to the front doors clear, the tile untouched. When I looked back at the window, all I had now was my own reflection and the floating white squares of overhead lights. Nothing more. Nothing to prove what I'd seen except the hot pinch under my ribs that told me my body had believed it before my mind had a chance to argue. I set the empty pot down and went back to the counter without filling anything. The rest of the shift didn't break open after that. That almost would have been easier. It stayed ordinary in all the ways that let me keep pretending I still had the upper hand. Customers came in, Receipts printed, gas pumps authorized. A radio check came through in a burst of static and half-heard numbers. Life kept going. But the clock stopped agreeing. The microwave over the hot case was a minute ahead of the register. The wall clock over the cigarettes was a minute behind that. My phone, when I checked it low by the drawer where customers couldn't see, didn't match either one. None of it was dramatic. No wild jumps, no flashing numbers, just enough disagreement to notice once and then keep noticing every time I looked. A glitch, bad settings, old electronics, stress, fatigue. I had explanations for all of it. The problem was that the place had started giving answers before I'd finished asking the questions. The rest of my first shift never gave me anything as clear as the doors or the reflection in the coffee glass. That almost made it worse. The place stayed just ordinary enough that I could keep trying to explain it. That was part of what made it work on me. I kept working. That was the dumb, practical truth of it. I rang up fountain drinks and prepaid gas. I handed out a towel set for shower 2 and wrote the room number and time on the board the way Lacey Harlan had shown me. I restocked creamer cups and wiped down a patch of counter that didn't need wiping because my hands wanted something to do. Every now and then I caught myself listening for the front doors before I looked at them. The radio started feeling different after 2:13 a.m. Not active. Not exactly. Just more pointed. Static would bloom low under a transmission and then cut out before I could decide whether there had been a voice in it. Once I looked over because I was sure I'd heard the first shape of my name in the hiss, but when I checked the base unit, it was quiet except for the charging light and the little grain of sound that never completely went away. Vern Haskell saw me looking and didn't say anything. That was almost worse than if he had. The hours after that dragged in the way overnight hours do when your body has stopped trusting the light around you. The front windows turned into mirrors with parking lot ghosts behind them. The truck lanes stayed bright. The rows beyond them sank in and out depending on whether a passing set of headlights caught the chrome and cab edges in the right way. More than once, I found myself glancing toward the coffee station for no reason, except that I didn't like not knowing what would be there if I looked. Nothing else happened I could call proof, but the whole shift had gone tilted. Not much. Just enough that when dawn started thinning the dark over the lot, I felt more relieved than I should have over a job I'd only been doing one night. Elaine did the last count at the register while I stood by the counter with my jacket half on, tired enough that the fluorescent lights had started to feel like pressure on my eyes. Lacey was in the hall stripping old towels from one of the rooms. Vern had gone somewhere toward the side office without me seeing him leave. Elaine glanced up from the schedule. "You coming back tonight?" Elaine asked. "I'll be here," I said. She looked at the schedule. "Then don't start getting weird on me." There wasn't any comfort in the line, but it felt close enough to approval that I took it. Outside, the morning air had gone colder, not warmer. That always happens right around dawn in the hills, like the night takes one last shot at you before it lets go. My pickup smelled like wet upholstery, old coffee, and the faint ghost of motor oil. I sat there with the key in my hand and looked down at my wrist again. I thought about quitting, not in some grand, dramatic way, just in the practical, bone-tired way a man thinks about any job that starts feeling wrong before he's earned his first full shift. I could leave. I could not come back. There were other places hiring somewhere. There were always other places hiring if you were willing to take enough bad news with the paycheck. Then I thought about Martin Keene's glass counter. I could still see the way he'd held the watch, turning it just enough to catch the face under the shop lights. Not impressed, not sentimental. Just interested in a professional way that told me he knew exactly what was in his hand. I had slept badly the night before because every time I drifted off, I saw my father's watch in somebody else's hand. Some stranger who'd appreciate it for all the wrong reasons. That was all it took. I drove to the motel, showered, lay down, and got maybe 4 hours of sleep in pieces too thin to do much good. Every time I woke, I checked the clock before I checked my phone. They never matched on the first look, even when they were both right. By late afternoon, the memory of the doors and the coffee glass had softened just enough for me to call them exhaustion if I wanted to. I wanted to. That was the problem. By the time I drove back out that night, the sky over the ridges was already drained down to gray and then black. The road in looked the same. Wet patches in the lot, diesel glow under the lanes, storefront lit up too bright for the hour. But stepping out of my truck the second night felt different from stepping out the first. The first night, I had arrived with a problem and a job. The second night, it felt like I was arriving somewhere that had kept my place for me. I hated that thought as soon as it came, which only made it harder to shake. I locked the truck, headed inside, and felt my shoulders tighten before the doors even opened. The chime hit on time. That should have helped. It didn't. Inside, everything was exactly where it had been the night before. The coffee lids still stuck in groups of 3 if you grabbed them too fast. The same old tape sat on the card reader. The same wash of fluorescent light flattened the color out of everything. But I noticed something else now. Lacey looked at me when I came in, then looked away too quickly. Elaine did the same thing 10 minutes later while pretending to check the till count. That was the part I couldn't sort. It wasn't fear exactly. It was attention. The kind people give you after a shift where something happened, but nobody has decided whether to say it out loud. Lacey was updating the board when I came behind the counter and put my things away. "People quit fast here," Lacey said. "Why?" I asked. She didn't look at me when she answered. "Depends who you ask." That sat with me the rest of the hour. The store got busier sooner on the second night. More drivers, more receipts, more wet boot prints drying to pale outlines on the tile. I slipped back into the work faster than I wanted to, and that bothered me too. Human beings can adapt to almost anything if the task list is clear enough. Cigarettes, cash, shower board, coffee, window, radio, start over. The place remembered me. I can't prove that sentence in any way that would satisfy a sane person, but it was true in the way some things are true before they can be explained. The static through the radio felt like it arrived when my attention drifted, not before. The windows caught me looking more often than I liked. The minute disagreements between the clocks were still there, and once I caught the register timestamp correcting itself after the receipt had already started printing. I stood there watching the last inch of paper feed out and told myself old systems do weird things under load. Then I told myself that again because the first time hadn't done the job. Rick Donnelly came in a little after 11 carrying road cold with him. He was broad through the shoulders, ball cap low, beard gone rough with a couple days of neglect, the kind of trucker face that could read as tired or mean depending on what he did next. He set a black coffee on the counter, along with 2 wrapped breakfast burritos and a pack of gum. When I looked up from the register, he was already looking at me. Not in the usual customer way, not impatient, not distracted, just steady. Rick set his coffee down. "You new here?" "That obvious?" I asked. He looked past me toward the lot. "It is." That was all. No grin, no elaboration. But he stayed there 1 second longer than the transaction required after I handed back his change. Long enough that I thought he might say something else, long enough that I almost asked what he meant. He didn't. He took the bag and headed for the door. I watched him go, just like I watched everybody go now. When the doors closed behind him, I realized Vern was standing near the coffee station again, not looking at me, but not looking either. There are moments at a job when you understand the next bad thing hasn't happened yet, but the shift has already started walking you toward it. That was what the second night felt like. Elaine watching more than she let on. Lacey answering only half a question. Rick Donnelly saying less than he knew. Vern moving through the store like he was waiting for a pattern to repeat. I kept working because I wasn't brave enough to do anything else, and because Thomas Halstead's watch was still sitting in Martin Keene's shop. Somewhere past midnight, while I was marking a shower time on the board and listening to the low static breathe through the radio base. I had the clear, unwelcome feeling that coming back for night 2 hadn't been like returning to work. It had felt like stepping back into a conversation the place had already decided to continue. The second night didn't turn bad all at once. It tightened. By the time midnight passed, everything that had felt slightly off the night before had stopped feeling isolated. The clock still disagreed. The radio still breathed static under normal traffic. The work kept moving, but none of it felt dependable anymore. Lacey Harlan had stopped wasting words with me by then. Elaine Burrow was in and out of the office, doing paperwork and drawer counts with the kind of concentration that says she doesn't have room for anything outside the immediate list in front of her. Vern Haskell moved through the building the way he always did, turning up where he needed to before I'd noticed a reason for him to be there. A little after midnight, a driver came in wearing a brown jacket with rain still dark on the shoulders. He wasn't memorable at first, mid-50s maybe, ball cap low, beard gone mostly white around the chin. He stood in front of the counter with both hands flat against the edge like he'd been driving too long and needed something solid under them. "Need a shower," the driver said. His voice was level, not impatient, not friendly either. Just flat enough that it took me a second to realize he hadn't asked for a room number yet. Then he looked toward the board and back at me like we both already knew which one he meant. I checked the board. 4's occupied. That much I got right. The dry erase mark was there. Room 4 had a time beside it. Occupied. I glanced at the hall monitor mounted next to the board. The hallway outside the shower rooms was empty. No one standing near the doors. No one coming out with a towel over his shoulder. No one moving through frame at all. Just the washed-out little black and white image of the hall, its tile floor and cinder block painted walls, and the 4 doors shut in a row under that dead overhead light. He kept his eyes on me. I already used it. That should have been the end of it. Tell him it's out of service. Don't hand over a towel. Don't push farther. That was the rule Vern had given me. It came back clear enough. But there's a point in certain conversations where your mouth steps in before your better judgment does, because the wrong thing in front of you is still wearing the shape of a normal exchange, and your brain keeps trying to force it into one. "When?" I asked. The second the word left me, I knew I'd made the wrong kind of mistake. Not loud, not obvious, nothing anybody else in the store would have heard and thought twice about. Just one small question dropped into the wrong slot. The driver didn't answer right away. He looked past me toward the shower board, then toward the hall monitor, then back to me. "Before you got here," he said, "there wasn't anything theatrical in the line. That was the trouble. If he'd smiled or leaned in or said it like he was messing with me, I could have fought it. But he said it like a man correcting a clerk who wasn't following along." I looked back at the board. The time beside room 4 had changed. I don't mean it changed while I watched the marker move or because somebody stepped up and rewrote it. I mean the number that had been there a second ago no longer matched the number I remembered seeing. It was earlier now. Not by much. Enough. My stomach went cold. I checked the hall monitor again. Still empty. When I looked back to the counter, the driver was no longer leaning on it. He was gone. No footsteps, no turn toward the door, no shape moving past the lottery rack, just gone from the spot where he'd been standing. I came around the counter before I fully decided to. The hall to the showers felt colder than the rest of the building, though that might have been because my skin had gone hot first. I stopped just outside the mouth of the corridor and listened. Nothing. Then a towel cartwheel clicked softly somewhere out of sight, farther in. Lacey had gone down that hall a minute earlier to strip one of the rooms. I knew that. I also knew I hadn't seen her come back. I called her name once, not loud. No answer. The hall monitor still showed nothing moving, which made even less sense now because I was looking straight at the hall itself, and it was there, real and narrow and washed in pale light, and I still couldn't see her. Then, one of the shower doors shut farther back with a flat mechanical sound. I took 2 steps in before Vern's voice hit from behind me, not raised but sharp enough to stop me. He didn't have to say much, just my name in a tone that made the hair on my arms lift. I turned. He was standing by the counter, one hand already near the radio, his face giving away nothing except that he had seen enough to know this wasn't getting better. Lacey came out of the hall 10 seconds later, carrying 2 used towels and wearing the expression of somebody walking back into a conversation she didn't know she'd left. She looked at me first, then at Vern, then back down the hall behind her like she expected to find the missing part there. Lacey looked at me after the hall went quiet. Was I gone long? That was answer enough. Elaine came out of the office then, irritated more than alarmed, asking what was taking so long with the towel count. Lacey looked at her, blinked once, and started talking like nothing had happened. Not pretending. More like she truly didn't know what there was to explain. She checked the board, frowned at room 4, wiped something off, rewrote it, then stopped with the marker in her hand and stared at the time she had just written. I watched her do the math on her face and lose it halfway through. The rest of the next hour felt heavier, because it had touched someone besides me. Up to then I could still pretend I was tired, keyed up, seeing patterns because Vern had put too many of them in my head too quickly. But Lacey had lost a section of time right in front of me, and the store had swallowed it so neatly that even she couldn't tell where it had gone. From then on, the hall monitor kept pulling at my eyes. Every empty frame looked temporary. Every occupied shower room felt wrong if I couldn't account for the body in it. More than once I checked the board in the hallway back to back just to make sure they still lined up. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. And every mismatch took a little more of the ground out from under me. By the time the wall clock staggered around to the stretch between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., my nerves had settled into that bad kind of alertness that makes every sound feel chosen. A truck had rolled in for diesel. Another one idled near the farther rows. The lot lights threw clean white over the lanes nearest the building and then gave up inch by inch the farther out you looked. I was at the side window, doing what I told myself was just checking the lot, when I saw someone waving from the far side of the truck parking. Not frantic, not running, just one arm lifting and lowering in a patient, deliberate motion. There was no truck near him. That hit first. Vern's rule. If there's no truck parked near the person waving, stay inside. My mind knew it the same way it knew not to put a hand on a hot burner, but the shape out there lifted an arm again, and this time the watched hand on my wrist turned cold all at once, like a ring of metal had just been fastened around bare skin. I looked down on instinct. The skin there was pale and raised in a narrow band, not bruised, not red, just pressed, like something had been sitting there too tight for too long. When I looked back out, the figure had moved a little closer, not close enough to make out a face, just enough that something in the line of the body, the angle of one shoulder, made a memory rise up before I had a chance to stop it. My father standing in the yard years ago in an old coat, one hand lifting because he didn't waste full waves when a smaller gesture would do. I knew it wasn't him. I knew that as cleanly as I know my own name, but knowing a thing and not following it are separate skills. I was around the end of the counter before I fully realized I'd moved. Vern must have seen it happen because the radio snapped hard with static and his voice came over the speaker from somewhere near the pumps or the office door behind me. Vern said over the radio, "Stay inside." "I know," I said. I was already at the side exit when I said it. The cold hit sharper outside. The air smelled like wet asphalt, diesel exhaust, and mountain damp coming down off the dark ridge behind the lot. The painted edge of the diesel lanes looked almost black under the lights, a clean dividing line between the worked part of the place and the deeper lot beyond it. The figure out there lifted an arm one more time. I crossed the line. Only one stride. Maybe two. but the second my boot went over the paint, the lot changed scale on me. The person out there didn't get closer. The trucks didn't feel as near as they should have. The white noise of engines and reefer units flattened out, like the whole lot had been covered with a glass bowl that let me see everything and hear almost none of it right. Distance stopped behaving like distance. The nearest row felt farther away. The far row felt like it had leaned in. Then the figure lowered its arm, and I saw there was still no truck anywhere near it, nothing parked beside it, nothing it could reasonably belong to. My left wrist went colder, not numb, pressed, as if something round and hard was tightening there notch by notch. Vern's voice came again, this time not through the radio but from behind me, somewhere near the doorway, low and hard enough to cut through the warped quiet. I turned toward it, and for one dizzy second, the building looked too far away too. Not physically farther, just less reachable. Then I stepped back over the painted line, and the lot snapped into proportions I recognized. The engines came back. The cold felt like cold instead of a condition. The figure out there was gone. By the end of the shift, the mark around my wrist hadn't faded. Under the fluorescent light inside, it looked like the skin remembered exactly where my father's watch had rested for years and had decided to hold the shape on its own. When I pressed 2 fingers to it, the flesh there felt colder than the rest of my hand. That was when the fear changed for me. Up to that point, I'd been afraid of losing the watch. By the end of night 2, I was starting to understand the place might be willing to keep more than that. I sat in my truck outside the motel after night 2 with the engine off and both hands in my lap, listening to it tick itself cooler in the dark. Dawn had started working its way into the sky, but not enough to help anything. The lot out front of the motel looked washed out and damp, all pale gravel and tired doors and the weak yellow glow from the office sign. Somebody's window unit rattled in one of the rooms upstairs. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked once and then stopped. I kept my left wrist turned up. The mark around it was still there. Under the parking lot light, it looked like a pressure band more than a bruise. Not red, not purple. Just a narrow line pressed into the skin in a perfect circle, exactly where the watch had sat for years. When I ran my thumb over it, the flesh there felt colder than the rest of my arm. Not numb, not dead, just wrong, like the skin had remembered the weight of metal and decided not to let it go. I should have gone inside and slept. I should have decided I was done. By then I had enough to call the place dangerous if I wanted to. Not in the normal way. Not in a way I could have explained to a cop or a manager or anybody who hadn't stood under those lights and watched a hallway stop making sense. But enough. Enough to know something in that building had started taking an interest in me, and enough to understand that staying away from it would have been the sane choice. I knew that. I also knew Martin Keene's deadline was still sitting there waiting for me. When I pawned the watch, he hadn't acted sentimental about it. That would have been worse. He had just looked at it carefully, looked at me carefully, and said what he was willing to say. "I can hold it till Monday," Martin told me. I'd looked at the watch sitting on the glass between us. After that, he spread his hands. After that, it's business. That was the truth of it. He wasn't threatening me. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was telling me how the world works when a man runs out of room to carry his own losses. The watch had value, not flashy value, not rich man value, the quieter kind, the kind that lived in weight, age, workmanship, and the look on Martin Keene's face when he realized somebody else would buy it fast if I failed to come back for it. I leaned my head against the seat and closed my eyes for a second. The memory of my father came cleaner then than it had all week. Not because I wanted it to, because my hand was on that cold mark and my mind had finally run out of other places to put itself. The hospital room had smelled like sanitizer, stale air, and the paper cup of coffee somebody had set down hours earlier and forgotten. The blinds had been half open. The light coming through them was flat and winter-colored. Thomas Halstead had looked smaller than I was built to accept. Not weak exactly, just narrowed, like the world had been taking pieces from him for months and had nearly finished the job. He didn't waste words near the end. That wasn't his way when he was healthy, and it sure wasn't his way then. He had the watch on, loose against his wrist because he'd lost weight. I remember that more clearly than I remember what the nurse looked like, or what day of the week it was, or what I said when I first walked in. He had worked the strap open with fingers that didn't want to do what he asked of them anymore. I reached to help, and he gave me that look fathers give when they need one last thing to be done by their own hand, if they can manage it. So I let him. When he finally got it off, he held it toward me. I put my hand out and he laid it across my palm. Then he reached again, slow, stubborn, and fastened it around my wrist himself. The leather felt warmer than it should have. His fingers shook. Mine did too, though I hadn't noticed it until then. "Keep it running," my father told me. That was all. No speech, no lesson bigger than the sentence, no declaration about family or time or what the watch meant. Just that. Plain enough to sound almost practical if you didn't know him. But I did know him. I knew the watch had been his one habit of care, the thing he wound and set and wore through years when plenty of other things in his life had gone looser than they should have. I opened my eyes in the truck and looked down at my wrist again. I never called the watch priceless. Men say things like that when they want other people to understand a feeling that won't sit still long enough to explain. I never needed to say it. The fact that I had walked into Martin Keene's shop with that watch in my hand and still made myself let it go told the whole story. That was the corner I was in. I could walk away from the travel center. I could call it done, take the loss, and tell myself a man can live without an object no matter whose wrist it used to be on. That was the sensible version. The version a person outside the story would choose for me every time. Then I looked at the cold ring around my skin and thought about the figure out in the lot raising one hand in that small, old-fashioned way. Thought about the way distance had bent. Thought about how fast my mind had reached for my father even when I knew better. The place had figured it out. It had taken 2 nights, but it had found the one thing in me that still worked like a hook. Not money, not pride, not the job itself, the watch, my father's hand fastening it on me. The idea that if I failed now, I wasn't just losing an object. I was losing the last thing Thomas Halstead had chosen to put in my care. I went inside the motel room eventually and slept for a few hours in the kind of broken pieces that don't add up to rest. Twice I woke, thinking I heard something metallic ticking from the bathroom sink. Once I sat up because I was sure I'd heard my father clear his throat in the room with me. Every time I looked, there was nothing there but motel furniture, weak daylight, and my own clothes where I'd dropped them. By late afternoon, I had done enough bargaining with myself to know I wasn't going to win. I wasn't going back because I thought I could fix anything. I wasn't going back because I thought I understood what that place wanted. I was going back because Martin Keene's deadline was still real, because the mark on my wrist was still cold, and because I couldn't live with losing what Thomas Halstead had put on my arm with his own failing hand. That was all the reason I had. It was also enough. Night 3 started before I got to the building. That was the first thing I understood. I felt it in the truck with the heater going and the wipers knocking a thin mist off the windshield, even though the rain had mostly stopped. I felt it pulling into the lot and seeing the storefront light spill over the wet pavement the same way it had the first 2 nights, only now nothing about it looked neutral anymore. The place didn't look waiting exactly. It looked prepared. I parked in almost the same spot as before and sat there with the engine running a little longer than I needed to. My wrist was already cold, not aching, not numb, just carrying that pressure band like the skin had learned to shape and refused to forget it. I rubbed my thumb over it and looked at the building and had the ugly thought that I was late to something I had never agreed to attend. Inside, the lights were the same hard fluorescent white. The coffee smelled the same. The card reader still had the strip of tape at the corner. But the second I stepped behind the counter, I started seeing signs that the store had moved something around me before I got there. The first one was on the schedule sheet clipped beside the register. Elaine had written the night assignments in fast block letters, Lacey on showers and stocking, Elaine on books and front coverage. My name was there too, but it had been written once and then written over, like somebody had gone back across it to make it darker. That alone didn't mean anything. People write over names all the time. What did mean something was the line beneath it. There was a check mark next to a coffee fill and a towel restock under my shift time that I had not done yet. I stood there looking at it until Elaine came out of the office and reached past me for the clipboard. She didn't notice what I was staring at, or if she did, she gave no sign. I told myself she had marked those early. I told myself Lacey had. I told myself it was paperwork, and paperwork is always wrong in small ways. Then I looked at the shower board. Room 4 had a towel count written beside it in marker I didn't recognize, and under that, lower down, my initials sat half smudged next to a time I knew I had never written. The mark on my wrist tightened. I wiped my palm on my jeans and looked toward the hall. Empty. Clean. Nothing moving there but fluorescent light and distance. I could feel the memory of the second night trying to rise back up through my body, the driver at the counter, the change time on the board, Lacey coming out of that corridor asking if she'd been gone long. I pushed it down and went to work, because work was still the only shape I had to move inside. For a while the shift let me pretend. A few customers came through. Coffee, gas, cigarettes. 2 men in reflective rain gear bought hot sandwiches that looked old enough to vote. A woman with a crying toddler paid for wipes and a bottle of children's Tylenol. Elaine kept disappearing into the office and back out again. Lacey moved through the hall and stock area with her shoulders set a little higher than normal, like she was trying not to look at any one place too long. Vern Haskell wasn't behind the counter when I came in, but I had the feeling of him in the building before I saw him, the way you feel a machine running in another room by the vibration under your feet. It was after midnight when the radio called my name the first time. The sound was so clean it made me jump anyway. "William," he said over the radio. I answered once. My own voice sounded too normal for the way my pulse had kicked. That was the worst part. If I'd sounded shaken, maybe I would have trusted myself more. Instead, I sounded like a clerk answering a routine call in a routine building on a routine night, and for half a second, I almost believed that was all it was. The radio went quiet again. Nobody said what they needed. No pump number, no room, no request. Just that one use of my name, dropped into the static, and then gone. I kept moving because Vern's rule had been clear, and because standing still in the middle of the counter felt more dangerous than doing my job. A minute later, the same voice came back. "William." Cooler. I didn't answer. That part of the rule held. My mouth stayed shut. But the damage was already happening somewhere lower than language. My head turned toward the back hall before I caught it. My body shifted with it. Cooler. The word had enough ordinary weight on its own to pull me 2 steps before I thought about what I was doing. That was how the place worked when it was smartest. It didn't always need to trick you with something impossible. Sometimes it just used the shape of a normal task and waited to see if your feet would help finish the mistake. I was almost past the end of the counter when a hand closed around my arm just above the elbow. Vern grabbed my arm. "If it calls you to the back, it's not the job anymore." I turned too fast, my shoulder tightening under his grip. Up close, he looked worse than he had the other 2 nights. Not sick, just thinner somehow, as if staying ahead of the place took mass off a man over time. "Then what is it?" I asked. He looked at me, tired and flat. "It's what stays." He let go of my arm then, but I didn't move. The radio sat on its charger behind us, quiet again, the light on it steady and innocent. The cooler door was farther back past the office and stock shelves, where the tile ended and the employee hall narrowed. From where I stood, it was just part of the store. A hallway, a door, a task waiting to be done. That was the problem. The place didn't invent a new world to pull people into. It used the existing one and leaned on it until the normal version gave way. Vern took me behind the counter and into the cramped office space where the filing cabinet sat against the wall and old schedules had been stuffed into a cardboard box under the desk. Elaine was up front with a customer. Lacey was somewhere in the hall. It gave us a minute, maybe less. Vern bent and pulled the box out with one hand. The top layer was recent enough to mean nothing to me. Current forms, fuel logs, old invoices. Then he flipped through the stack and put one schedule sheet in my hand. Eddie Mays. The name was on the page in faded marker beside nights, repeated down the week in the same square block lettering I'd seen on newer sheets. Then, on the next schedule, there was a line through his name. On the one after that, no name at all in the slot where it should have been, just an empty night with someone else's handwriting filling tasks around the gap, as if the shift had still been covered by something not worth labeling. I looked up at Vern. He didn't let me ask the easy version. He reached back into the box and handed me another sheet. This one was newer, recent enough that the paper hadn't yellowed. John Pritchard's name sat on 2 nights, then 1, then vanished midweek. But under the task notes for the nights after that, the handwriting changed. The board entries got messier. Coffee fill, towel restock, pump reset, all in short, hard little notations that looked less written than pressed into the paper. No signature, no initials. Just the work itself continuing as if whoever had been supposed to do it never stopped. I didn't need Vern to explain all of it. That was the part that hit hardest. The rules had already done the explaining. The doors, the coffee station, shower 4, the far side of the lot, the radio. They weren't separate weird things. They were one process seen from 5 angles. First acknowledgement, then service, then crossing, then instruction. The doors, the coffee, shower 4, the lot, the radio. They were all the same process wearing different faces. Vern saw the pattern land on me before I said any of it. "The rules aren't there to save you," Vern said. He held my eyes until I understood he meant exactly what he said. "They're there so this place doesn't count you." That was the whole thing. The rules weren't there to beat the place. They were there to keep you from finishing whatever it needed from you. My mouth had gone dry. That was why the doors mattered, why the coffee at 2:13 a.m. mattered, why shower 4 mattered, why the diesel lanes mattered, why the radio mattered most of all. Each one was a chance to finish something I should have left incomplete. And I had already done too much. I had half greeted the thing at the door. I had looked into the glass behind the coffee station when I should have walked away. I had asked the shower 4 driver when. I had crossed the line into the truck lot. I had answered the radio once and turned toward the cooler on the second call without meaning to. That was enough to make the room feel smaller around me. Not because I thought I was dead, because I finally understood the real danger was worse than dying cleanly. Eddie Mays hadn't just left. John Pritchard hadn't just quit. The work had gone on around the shape of them. The tasks kept appearing. The notes kept getting made. The place kept running. And somewhere inside that running, pieces of them had stayed behind. From the front counter, the radio crackled softly again. Not words this time, just static. But I heard invitation in it now because I knew what it was doing. The cold ring around my wrist tightened another notch. I looked down at it and knew, with a certainty that made my stomach drop, that the place had already started writing me in. If I finished the wrong sequence that night, I wasn't going to lose a shift. I was going to become part of one. Once I understood what the rules had really been doing, the only question left was whether I finished the process or walked away from it first. The radio cracked again from the front counter, not words, just static, but it pulled at me anyway. Vern Haskell knew it did. I could see it in the way he watched me from the office doorway, not trying to talk me out of fear, just trying to see if I was still steering my own body. That was the level we were at by then. Not courage, not plans, just whether a man could still decide where his feet went. The colder my wrist got, the more the back hall seemed to narrow in my head. I didn't want to go toward it. That was the truth. Want had nothing to do with it. The place had figured out that it didn't need me willing. It only needed me unfinished. I stepped out of the office first. Vern caught my arm for a second, then let go when he felt I wasn't lunging for the hall. Elaine was up front with a customer, moving too fast through a register problem to notice much else. Lacey Harlan was by the shower board, marker in hand, staring at something she'd written like she didn't remember doing it. The store was still running. That was the ugliest part of all of it. Even with something rotten sitting under the whole shift, coffee still sold, receipts still printed, and the floor still needed mopping. Then I heard it from farther back than the cooler door should have allowed. "William," the voice said. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It had my father in it, not perfectly. If I'd heard it on a recording, or through a bad phone line, or across a room with a television on, I might have told myself it was close enough, but not real. In that building, in that moment, close enough was worse than perfect. It let my head fight while the rest of me reacted. My hand closed around the cold ring on my wrist. The voice came again, not saying more, only putting my name in the air like it belonged to whoever was waiting in the back. Then there was a sound behind it, a soft metallic tick, small, precise, the exact kind of sound my father's watch made if you held it close enough in a quiet room. That hit lower than thought. For one stupid second, I could see it in my head so clearly that I nearly moved on the image alone. The watch sitting somewhere just out of sight past the cooler, maybe on a shelf, maybe hanging from a pipe, maybe lying on the concrete where somebody had set it down for me to find. The place knew by then that if it put the right shape in front of me, I would do the rest of the work myself. "Don't," I said. I don't know whether I meant the voice, the place, or my own body. Maybe all three. I took one step toward the hall anyway. The air back there felt different. Colder, yes, but also tighter. Like the building had lungs, and this was the part of it that held the breath in. The cooler door stood shut at the far end under the weak overhead light. The shelves along the hall cast hard little shadows across boxes and cleaning supplies. Everything looked plain enough to walk into. That was the trick. Nothing about it asked to be believed. It only asked to be followed. I saw the watch before I saw anything else. Not clearly. Not enough to swear to in daylight. Just a glint low and dull near the cooler threshold where there should not have been any metal catching light. My whole body leaned toward it before I stopped myself. The pressure around my wrist tightened so hard it felt for a second like skin might split under it. That was when I understood I was not going to beat that place by taking back what it offered. The whole trap depended on finishing what it started. If I reached for what it was offering, I was done. If I reached for the watch, I was done. I looked back toward the front counter. The radio base sat there on its charger. My badge was clipped to my shirt. My name was on the schedule in handwriting that had already started to feel less like mine. All the ordinary little pieces of work the place had been using to sort me into itself were still in place. So I did the only thing that felt like the opposite of all of it. I took off my badge. I'm done. The words sounded stupid the second they left my mouth. Small, human, not magic, not brave. But work runs on small human things. A badge, a name, a shift start, a task accepted, a line crossed. If the place wanted to keep me by making me finish the job, then quitting had to mean more there than it did anywhere else. I walked back to the office, found the schedule sheet on the clipboard, and put a line through my own name hard enough to tear the paper a little. Then I pulled the radio off its charger and yanked the battery free. Static died instantly. The quiet after that sounded enormous. Behind me, from the hall, came one sharp sound like something striking metal, then another, then nothing. Vern was beside me again. He didn't speak. He just watched the hall, then watched me, as if measuring whether I had more leaving in me or not. Lacey looked up from the shower board with her face gone pale under the lights. Elaine came out from the register area, angry about something, and stopped when she saw all of us frozen in place. None of them asked what happened next because nothing happened in the way people usually mean it. No monster came down the hall. No door burst open. The building didn't shake. The pressure simply changed, slowly, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. Outside, the black at the windows had started thinning toward that dead gray color that comes before dawn commits to being morning. The lot lights looked weaker against it. The trucks out there went back to looking like trucks. By the time I stepped outside, my wrist still felt like ice under the skin, but the world had gone back to looking the way it should. The diesel lanes were diesel lanes again. The far lot was just distance. The cold was just cold. I worked 3 nights at Black Ridge Travel Plaza. I never worked a 4th. Later that day, after sleep that didn't help much, I went back to Martin Keene's shop with the money from those nights and whatever else I could scrape together. He took the bills, counted them twice, then opened the drawer behind the glass and set the watch down between us. Martin set the watch on the glass. "You made it back." I closed my hand around it. I did. It felt heavier than I remembered. Colder, too. Not dead, still running. I could feel the tiny movement inside if I held it tight enough. He looked at my wrist. I didn't answer right away. There wasn't any answer he needed. I took the watch home. I still have it. I never put it on again. It stays in a box now, wrapped in an old t-shirt, face down and unwound. Some nights I still wake a minute before 2:13 a.m. with the skin around my left wrist gone cold. Sometimes the microwave and the clock in my bedroom disagree by exactly 1 minute, and I have to leave the room until I can stop looking at them. I don't trust late chimes. I don't trust reflections in dark glass, and I don't trust any job that tells you the shift ends when the clock says so. Because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the only thing that matters is whether the place decides you're still on the clock.